The forest does not become dangerous the moment you enter it. That is the lie people tell themselves because it feels safer that way. They imagine danger as something loud. A scream in the dark. Footsteps behind them. A shadow moving between trees. But the oldest fears do not arrive like that. The oldest fears arrive quietly. 3 separate hikers would later describe the same sensation. Each one on different trails. Different years. Different companions. But the experience followed the same pattern. There are places in the mountains where hikers describe the exact same feeling without knowing each other, without sharing trails, without even walking in the same state. They describe reaching a point deep in the wilderness where another presence begins moving beside them so naturally that the moment it starts is impossible to identify. And every single person who experienced it realized the truth too late. The first account comes from a long-distance hiker moving through a remote mountain corridor where the trail narrows between dense forest and uneven rock. It was supposed to be an ordinary stretch of travel, the kind where days blur into repetition and the only real company is the sound of your own footsteps. For the first hour, everything followed that expected rhythm. Wind in the trees. Pack shifting slightly with movement. The steady pattern of walking that becomes almost unconscious after enough miles. Then the rhythm stopped being exclusively his. At first it was subtle. A second set of steps behind him that did not announce itself with approach or distance, it simply existed as if it had always been part of the trail. He did not remember hearing it begin. That was the first detail that made him slow down. In normal conditions, sound has a transition. Even quiet footsteps have a moment of origin. But this had none. It was already in sync with him from the moment he became aware of it. He turned slightly, expecting another hiker to be behind him at a distance. There was a figure there, positioned in the exact spacing you would expect from someone who had been walking behind another person for some time. Same posture. Same hiking gear. Same natural forward lean that comes from carrying weight over distance. Nothing about it looked immediately wrong, and that is what made the mind hesitate. The figure gave a small greeting gesture without breaking stride. The kind of casual acknowledgement hikers use when passing through shared terrain. It felt normal enough that the moment passed without resistance. He even adjusted his pace slightly so they could walk side by side, because that is what people do when someone joins their trail rhythm. They walked like that for a while. Long enough for conversation to form. Long enough for names to be exchanged, whether to be mentioned, the usual structure of temporary companionship to take shape. Everything was consistent with real human behavior. Almost too consistent. Not in the sense of being wrong, but in the sense of never deviating, never hesitating, never inserting the small imperfections that naturally appear in speech and movement. The first disruption was repetition. A detail was spoken once, then repeated again moments later in the exact same wording. Not summarized. Not paraphrased. Repeated as if the sentence had been stored and played back without interpretation. At first, it could still be dismissed as distraction or fatigue. The kind of mistake anyone makes during long physical exhaustion. But then came the rhythm problem. Their steps aligned too perfectly. Not loosely matched. Not gradually synchronized, but immediately identical. Every footfall mirrored. Every pause matched at the exact same instant. Human movement does not naturally behave like that without conscious coordination. Yet there was no visible effort to coordinate. And then came the moment where uncertainty turned into recognition of something deeper. When he stopped walking, the figure stopped at the exact same instant. Not after him. Not in response with delay. At the same time, as if the concept of decision had been shared between them before either body acted on it. That was the first time the trail did not feel like terrain anymore. It felt like observation. And somewhere further down the same path, without sound or visible movement, something continued walking that had already learned what he was going to do next. The second account did not begin on the trail. It began at a shelter, the kind built into remote stretches of forest where people assume they are briefly safe because the structure has walls on 3 sides and a roof that blocks the sky. But safety in places like that is often just a feeling, not a condition. and feelings are not always accurate in the woods after dark. 2 hikers had arrived before sunset and confirmed the register. Only their names were listed for that night. No one else had signed in ahead of them, and no one else was expected. That kind of isolation is normal on long routes, especially during off-peak weeks. It creates the illusion that the entire landscape has temporarily narrowed down to just a few people and a very large silence. They cooked in that silence while there was still light. Ate quickly. Spoke less than usual. Not because anything was wrong, but because the environment encourages quiet without asking for it. By the time darkness settled in completely, the shelter had become a contained space inside something much larger and much darker. The first sound came after midnight. Not footsteps at first. Voices. A man's voice, speaking at a calm and ordinary volume, as if continuing a conversation that had already been in progress long before they were aware of it. It carried through the open front of the shelter without effort, describing trail conditions, distances, water sources, things hikers talk about naturally. The tone was so normal that the mind initially refused to assign it danger. At first, they assumed it was late arrivals. Other hikers catching up after dark, speaking while approaching. That explanation held for a few minutes, because it was the simplest one available. But something began to feel misaligned. The voice did not approach. It stayed. And then it did something that broke the pattern of normal speech. It used a name. Not a general address like hey or you. A specific name. One of theirs. That was the first moment the shelter stopped feeling like an open structure and started feeling like a contained listening space. Because there was no logical reason for someone outside to know who was inside unless they had already been there long enough to learn it. One of them sat up. The other followed immediately after, without needing explanation. That shared reaction created a silent confirmation. They were both hearing the same thing, and neither of them had initiated it. Then came the second violation. A sentence they had spoken earlier that evening, repeated back to them word for word from outside the shelter. Not similar wording. Not paraphrased memory. Exact replication, delivered in the same sequence, as if it had been recorded and replayed by something that did not need to understand meaning in order to reproduce it. At that point, the direction of the sound became irrelevant. The front of the shelter was empty. No movement. No visible presence. Only the continuation of a voice that did not belong to the space it was occupying. Then they heard breathing. Not in front. Not in the clearing. From the side wall. Close enough that it suggested something standing directly against the structure itself, pressing into it without entering it. Controlled breathing. Deliberate restraint. The kind of breathing that implies awareness of being heard. They stayed inside until morning did not feel like an option but like an escape condition. When they finally left, there were no signs in the ground outside the wall. No disturbance in the soil. No impression that anything had been standing there for any measurable time. But what stayed with them was not the voice. It was the realization that the voice had not been improvising. It had been repeating what it had already learned. Before we move forward, have you ever been hiking? And do you actually enjoy it? Drop your answer in the comments. The third account is the one that most people try to explain away first, because it looks the most human at the start. It happens in open terrain, during daylight, in a section of forest where visibility is still good and nothing about the environment suggests isolation. That is usually when the mind relaxes its guard. When it assumes that if something were wrong, it would at least be hidden in shadow or distance. It began with a familiar figure. A hiking partner who had been walking the same route for years. Someone whose patterns were already known, already stored in memory. The way they walked. The way they paused. The way they shifted weight when resting. Recognition in that kind of relationship is not a conscious process anymore. It happens automatically, like identifying your own reflection. So when the figure appeared off-trail among the trees, there was no immediate alarm. Only confusion about positioning. Why they would be there instead of continuing ahead. The call of their name went unanswered. That was the first small break in expectation. Not dramatic, not alarming on its own, but enough to require attention. Approaching closer was natural at first. Because everything else matched. Clothing matched. Gear matched. Proportions matched. Even posture matched. Nothing was missing, and nothing was obviously added. It was correct in every structural detail a person normally uses to identify someone. But correctness is not the same as presence. When distance closed enough for facial recognition to become certain, something subtle shifted in perception. The face had all the correct features in all the correct positions, but it did not carry expression in a way that felt alive. It was not anger, fear, or emptiness. It was absence of transition. No micro-movements. No adjustment in response to being observed. It was as if the face was not reacting to being seen. It was simply positioned. The moment held too long. Long enough for the mind to begin searching for inconsistencies that were not immediately visible. Because humans are not built to accept perfect replication without emotional signals attached to it. Even stillness in a real person has small imperfections, breath changes, eye movement, subtle shifts in attention. None of that was present. When their name was spoken again, there was still no response. No acknowledgement. No delay. No misunderstanding. Only continued still positioning. That was when the body began to interpret the situation before the mind fully accepted it. A backward step happened without conscious decision. Then another. Not fear-driven at first, but correction-driven. Like removing oneself from a misaligned equation. Turning away became the final confirmation that something was wrong. Because the figure did not follow. It did not react. It did not adjust. It remained exactly as it had been the entire time, as if movement and attention were irrelevant variables. Later, when contact was re-established with the actual person at the planned meeting point, everything matched perfectly again. Same gear. Same path. Same timeline. No deviation into the area where the figure had been seen. There was no second version of events that could be independently verified. Only the memory of something that had been correct in every measurable detail except the one that mattered most. It looked like a person, but it did not behave like one that was aware of being observed. By the time all three accounts are placed side by side, the details stop behaving like separate incidents and start behaving like variations of the same mechanism. Different locations, different people, different conditions, but the structure underneath them begins to repeat with uncomfortable precision. Not what was seen. What changed immediately after a decision. In the first case, the moment came when the hiker stopped walking and chose to rest. In the second, when the decision formed to leave the shelter rather than remain inside it. In the third, when the choice was made to turn away and return to the trail instead of continuing the approach. Each of these moments looks ordinary on the surface. No dramatic action. No visible signal. Just a simple internal shift, an intention forming before the body follows it. And yet that is exactly where everything broke. Because in every account, the presence did not react to movement itself. It did not respond to footsteps, speech, or distance changing. It responded at the exact instant a decision became clear enough that action was inevitable. That distinction matters. If something can register intent before action, then escaping it is not a matter of speed or direction. It becomes a matter of whether thought itself is observable. And if that understanding is precise enough, then even escape becomes part of the pattern it has already accounted for.